Right. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Today we're going to talk about IPA, the next steps. This presentation is focused on audience of business users and technology professionals that maybe have some exposure to IPA, maybe are using IPA in the organization and are thinking about ways to really up the game and take advantage of all the new feature functionality that's come out in Infor's workflow product over the past year or two. So first, of course, let's remind you, we are RPI consultants. We are an Infor Alliance partner with Cloud Suite Specialization. Our firm was founded in Baltimore, Maryland in 1999, and we currently operate a nationwide practice of consultants spanning all areas of the Infor Lawson solution. So today, we're going to touch on a couple of different topics. We'll start by digging into approval flows. We'll talk about user account automation with IPA. We'll talk through a couple of tips and tricks for interface work with IPA. Touch on some system maintenance automation we can do. Jeremy will show you a cool new feature, sort of reprising an older feature in process flow to separate out work unit administration. And finally, we'll end our presentation talking about IPA 11. All right, so let's talk about enhancing approval flows. A lot of organizations out there got their first use of process flow by building out requisition approval. And maybe you've had a rec approval flow for 5 years, maybe even 10 years. There probably hasn't been a lot of reason to change it. So let's talk about some things that you could do to really bring that approval flow forward into the next generation and take advantage of all the new functionality in IPA. First thing I'd like to talk about is exception handling. Of course, whenever you have an approval process going on in IPA, somebody needs to be responsible for the occasional work unit failure or the missing approver or what have you. And this can be difficult if you are tasked with every day monitoring the work unit screen, the work unit log, and looking through for errors. So we definitely recommend building exception handling right into the flow. One technique that I like to use is I like to set up an IPA task for our process administrator. I'll use the error connections, and I'll use branch nodes to detect when something's gone wrong in a flow, or detect when something is about to go wrong, such as I'm about to go into a user action node where we don't have an approver assigned for that task and category. And then I'll divert the flow logic into a special in-basket that our administrator will use to keep track of those handful of work unit transactions that require attention. From within that special in-basket, I'll also give our administrator the ability to restart the flow from the beginning or unrelease the transaction. So that saves our administrator the trouble of potentially having to manually restart a work unit, maybe having to say go to the RQ13 screen and manually unrelease a rec or something like that. We want to keep all that activity right within the in-basket. So if an approver assignment needs to get made, our flow can easily be restarted from the beginning.
And as your process flow is going through and assigning work to users, it could be that your user hasn't been fully set up yet in process automation. So one thing that you can do is to build that out on the fly right within your process. So there's multiple things you have to check to make sure all these security elements are in place. So the WF user flag on the RMID, the in-basket user role on the landmark side, and then of course the IPA user profile record as well needs to be created. So all of these things can be done within your process flow. And then reroute to administrator's basket, similar to what Richard was speaking of on the last slide, if additional human action is needed. And I'll throw this in as a little teaser. There's a way in version 11 that's going to make this even easier.
Cool. One of the things that we were most excited about with IPA was the ability for approvers to take action directly from an email rather than having to go into a web in-basket. That's a great feature to roll out in your organization, but of course, if an approver is going to make a decision without actually logging into Mingle and taking a look at the transaction details, that person needs to have all of the relevant information to make that decision presented to them right in the email. So prior to enabling approved by email, you want to take a good look at your email notifications and make sure they contain everything. Now, this is actually one of the most tedious parts of an IPA developer's job, is getting these notifications looking good, bringing in all the information. The technique that we normally use is a series of SQL queries to pull out header and line detailed data and related information, and then message builders to lay out everything in HTML tables. This ends up creating a very large message builder output variable, and we know that that data doesn't persist through user actions. So if you have multiple levels of approval, you need to rebuild the email body every time. So try to take that part of your flow logic and have it reused each time you run through a user in basket. That'll make maintenance a lot easier if you treat it somewhat like a subroutine portion of the flow. Another thing I'd like to mention about email notifications is you can change the default styling, the colors and the fonts, and even how those approved buttons look. That's done by editing the CSS that gets written out into the email header. You do that in Rich Client under Process Server Administration, Configuration, and then Translation. On that translation screen, you'll see at the bottom where the email header text is listed. You can edit it right there. Let's take a look at an example of what makes a great email notification. We want to bring in all of the information regarding the underlying transaction that we're trying to approve. So header, and then list out all the detail or line level records below that. If we have an approver that's higher up in the chain, a second or third level approver, they really appreciate seeing what's happened with this transaction already. If someone has already reviewed it and approved it, who was that person, when did that happen? So we like to list out a history of what's already happened to this work unit within the message. Of course, we have to rebuild that every time so it stays current. Don't forget to bring in names and descriptions of things like accounting unit or account or vendor. If there are a lot of codes and numbers in the email, our approval user might not be familiar with all the account codes. So it's great to bring in the names for those too. And if you're using a document imaging system or have related records in some other system, it's nice to include a link to that so we can view maybe a PDF or an image that's attached to the transaction. There are a couple settings in IPA that we can use to control approved by email. One of them is the email actions base URL. This is set in your configuration set under the email tab, and that basically gets your approved links pointed to your landmark server. This is an optional setting. Sometimes the system can correctly determine the correct URL. But if your approved links don't seem to be working and you're getting 404 errors, or it's just doesn't seem to be connecting you to the right server, check out your email action-based URL setting. We have a couple of settings to enforce login or change the way that login works. Out of the box, our approve button in the email is going to take immediate action, and it doesn't really enforce that the person that's clicking that link is the person that you had sent that action to. Most organizations that we work with want to require that the user who's receiving that notification authenticate to the system prior to accepting what their response is. These settings are set up by adding a system property into the system configuration set. This is documented in the IPA admin guide. There is a property you can set, email action authentication required, which will enforce that login. So if the respondent to the approval message doesn't already have a mingle session open, it'll actually prompt them for the username and password before it allows that action to take place. In newer versions of IPA, newer versions of Landmark 10.1.1, when you turn that on, the system will actually validate that the person who is signing in at the point that they're taking the action is the same person that email was sent to. So it prevents one person from forwarding their email to someone else in the organization, allowing that other person to make an approval decision. But maybe you'd like to allow email forwarding. Maybe you'd like a manager or director who's out of the office to be able to say forward the message to a coworker who's in the office to really dig in and make a decision. In order to do that, you create a property and system configuration set called email action allow email forwarding. At that point, we'll require that our approver log in, but they don't necessarily have to be the same person the email was sent to. So how do we manage that disparity? The user action node has an output variable. It's called underscore users. It's an array, so you want to pull the first value in that array. So you read your user action underscore users 0 variable, and that's going to give you the username of the person that actually took the action. And you can have logic in your flow that compares that to maybe who should have taken the action and potentially allow it or not allow it, depending on the organizational relationship there. Another thing that we like to do in our approval flows is help our business users with a perspective into what happened, what is going on with approval transaction, make it very easy for people to look back and see who approved, when did they approve, what happened. Of course, all of this data is stored in the PFI metrics table in the IPA database, but keep in mind that your business users might not have access to easily take a look at what's in there. So sometimes we'll build logic right within the flow to help track approval history in other places. A real common technique, especially with, say, requisitions, is to use attachments or comments over on the Lawson side. So, we might have web runs that add rec header comments, rec header attachments, sort of giving, leaving a breadcrumb trail of what's going on with the transaction. Another area that we'll use sometimes is work unit messaging. That's visible in the in-basket. That's also where your reason messages end up. And of course, we want to read out our underscore users variable that our output from our user action node. we can potentially identify if a proxy approval has taken place and bring that to the forefront. And it's in organizations that don't have a very simple schema for usernames, such as first initial, last name, can be super helpful to look up a full name to match that username and use that full name when we're recording who took action on the approval. This is particularly relevant for organizations that maybe use an employee number as their username, and if when you're looking through and just seeing a list of employee numbers, that doesn't really help you understand. So we have a couple of questions.
Sure, and this is relevant to what you're talking about right now, but the question is, our users must either be on-site or use VPN access for Infor. If they get an email while off-site, do they need to be logged in via the VPN for their approval or rejection to take process?
Yeah, so the answer is generally yes. The way that those buttons work that are in the email is they're really just links back to the Landmark server. So when you click the button at the bottom of the email, it's going to pop up your web browser, taking you to a page on the Landmark server, which will record your action. So you need network connectivity back to the Landmark server. So that generally means being on the corporate network, unless you've gone through and created an external endpoint for Landmark and exposed it to the internet.
That was it.
Okay, great. Hey, Jeremy, you want to take us through reason codes?
Sure. So with the Landmark applications such as Global HR or Contract Management and now the financials, when you send something to a user for approval, it's built-in functionality to prompt that user for a reason code. Maybe you're expecting a reason if they actually reject or deny a transaction. So you want to do that. Well, you can build that out in S3 too. It does require a little bit of configuration to make that happen, but it is available. And again, you can capture that information and require it. One of the first things that you have to do, and this is starting in Landmark version 10.1.1 CU28 is when this became available. If you look at this action request screen here, this is on a user action node. My action name is reason here. There's an option now to show reason code pop up. But if you look, the subject for the reason code is blank. And that's because this is tied to an S3 instance of IPA. So what we have to do to build that out is go into Configuration Console. So we have to basically open up Configuration Console and customize the data area. And we do that just by adding subjects. Now, for this example, I've just have the subject of S3, but you could add various subjects to whatever your business need is for those processes. And as we step through, then you come back in here, you see now that S3 subject code, reason subject, is available for you to pick from. So is that it? Well, not quite. You still have to actually add the reason codes then that are associated with that subject. So once we go back in through the Process Server Administrator and pull up those configuration screens. And this is where we're actually going to define actual reasons and descriptions that go along with that subject. That way, when you get an approver message and you hit the approve or reject button, you get that prompt to select a reason code and then type in an additional message. Now, depending on the action, you can configure it to be have the reason code and the message required. So maybe on a reject, you are always going to require it, but you would make it optional for an approve message.
Cool. That's a great feature to have available because we've always struggled to notify the original requester of why a transaction is being sent back. And often that's done out of band, maybe a separate email or a phone call. This way we can bring all of that information back into IPA and it remains as part of our audit trail. All right, let's talk about IPA for user account management. This has been a really popular topic lately, is this concept of using IPA to create loss in user accounts, especially as your Infor solution grows and becomes more complex with applications on the landmark side, applications on the S3 side. IPA becomes very valuable to save a lot of time provisioning users for organizations that use employee space or employee self-service. That could be many hours a week of work that's alleviated by automating this with a flow. So, a lot of organizations out there have invested in this type of development and set up a flow that's driven by the new hire process to create loss-in user accounts. Taking that to the next level, we can actually make the HCM solution the system of record for network access and roles and permissions. We can compare an employee's place in the organizational structure, whether or not they're a supervisor, to what access they have in Lawson and GHR and even in other systems to reconcile that data and ensure that no employees are set up with more or less access than they should have for their job function. Many organizations drive user provisioning out of an IT help desk system or a ticketing system, and really we can use our Infor HCM solution for that purpose. If you're using Global HR to manage your employees, you can add fields to store their Active Directory username or other network-related attributes. Use action requests, allow your IT provisioning staff to access this data and maintain this data. And when it comes to things like assigning an email address, assigning a username, they can do that right within Global HR, and at that point IPA can actually build out an Active Directory account. So we can use PowerShell scripts from System Command Node to allow IPA to create the elements in our Windows domain that users need.
So to add on to that, we can, as more organizations are implementing the Global HR solution, we can implement a role-based security process here as well. So of course everyone gets the employee role. That's easy. So a user account gets created, that one just gets automatically applied. But as we look at the other roles within the Global HR application, HR generalist, recruiter, requisition approver, supervisor, those can be clearly defined by job type or a job category, or a position code or something about those jobs that can really kind of allow you to look at your people and their job function and base that security assignment on that. So you're really doing a reconciliation against your employee demographic, your employee data, their position, and comparing it against their existing security within the application. So the way you would do this is just compare that data against what's already defined in the actor role business class. So you can look for discrepancies, you can look for things that are missing, and you can look for things that are there that should no longer be there. So as your employees transfer in and out of a supervisor role or into HR or out of HR to another area within your organization, all of that can be identified both by those job types and categories.
So we're talking about an ongoing reconciliation process rather than a process that's driven by change events. That's going to give you a more accurate match, and it's going to check every day if there are any mismatches in security.
Right, and the best way to handle that, of course, with Global HR, everything's driven off of effective dates, all your actions, and as users move in and out. So the best way to kind of handle that is to run this daily after your effective date processing is complete. So of course that happens at midnight, and then beyond that would be the time to run that early in the morning. So you have real-time updates every day to those users' security as they move in and out of different positions within the organization. There's multiple ways to do this. You could define several queries to look at each of those components, each of those security roles, and define the criteria based on the user's setup or their position. Or you can kind of pull it all into one query. I just want to highlight this as a feature that's available in IPA. But what I know that most IPA developers, when they get to this screen, when they're building that landmark transaction, they will generally, the data area field will generally be set as a variable so that you can transition from test to production. However, the other fields here are generally just used hard-coded because you have one transaction that you're trying to do. But if you include that action name in your query, so when you're reconciling against people's roles that they should have and people's roles that they shouldn't have, you can include the action name such as assign role to actor and delete right in your query, so you can actually use that as a variable too and kind of consolidate everything into one massive query. And it's just one loop that kind of handles everything as you look at it. Now, it does require a little bit more complicated SQL to do all of that, but it is something that is possible. And even beyond that, then we have the actor context within the global HR. So this is more than just the employee ST role, but linking those employee agents directly to the actor. The same with the internal candidate if you're using the TA portion of global HR. And then you've got the job board and the HR organization, which of course also need to be tied to those actor records, and that can all be done through process flow.
Let's talk about some ways that we can use IPA to actually manage security. Of course, you've got security on both the LSF side of your solution as well as the landmark side. So you have your RM update nodes to manage security on the Lawson side. You've got your landmark transaction nodes to manage security overall on the landmark side. One thing we like to do, especially on a user create, is actually just do a web run node that calls the ISS screen to build out the account. Of course, when you create a user account, if you're doing that with RM updates, with landmark transactions, it's not immediately available for you in ISS to do any manual account maintenance there, because ISS has its own database that needs to be refreshed. So our technique of using a web run directly to ISS to call the account create sort of alleviates that problem. We can see that account right away in ISS. It's one place that we need to call to build out the account on both sides of a federated system. Of course, that does carry a potential downside, and that is if you apply an ISS update, these screens weren't really meant to be called as a web API. So Infor might change the way the screen is laid out, requiring you to go back and update your web run to be compatible. So there is that potential maintenance there whenever ISS is upgraded. If you are doing RM updates and landmark transactions, you can always execute a list-based sync to bring ISS back up to speed. That's done by creating a file, listing out just the usernames that you want to process, and an SSO config command to initiate that list-based sync. All right, so now that we've covered user account automation, let's talk about some different tips and techniques related to interface work with IPA.
So you may have a need in your organization for a fairly complicated interface, and that interface may involve several steps, and that may involve several process flows kind of strung together, but they have to be processed sequentially. An example of this is the global HR interface down to S3 for pushing payroll data, required data down into S3. There's a series of interface process flows that come delivered with the global HR product, and you typically will just have to run them in a certain sequence. And that's different for every client, depending on what data you're actually pushing down, what you need to consume in your S3 environment. So instead of, one way of handling that is to take the delivered process flows and code in the end to trigger the next flow automatically. However, then you're modifying those delivered flows, and the next upgrade that comes along, the next patch that comes along, you're going to have to go back and make those changes. So why not use a controller flow where you're basically just calling those delivered flows from Infor one at a time, and you want to make sure that you set the trigger parameter on that trigger node to service sync so that it waits for that first flow to finish before it moves on to the next one. And of course, as this flow is executing, you can be capturing error messages, you can be calculating times that it takes for things to run, and you can send a notification message then to your end users that need to know when this interface is completed. There's also, as we look at more real-time transaction processing, so, that's the concept of global HR. It's kind of moving away from batch, and the same thing, as we look at the financials in the future too, that it's moving away from the pure batch processing and looking at that real-time transaction. So you may have a need to really just you may no longer have the need to generate these huge files once a day and send over. Now you can look at things real time, and maybe you start writing process flows that are building web service calls using SOAP calls. And that's available with that web service node that's available in Process Automation. So this is just an example of building that SOAP call using the XML nodes to string all that together, and then making one final call out to whatever service it is that you're calling. It could be just a manual form that you're going out onto a vendor's website that you need to periodically update some information on, and that can be done if the vendor supports it with a web service call.
Yeah, web services are definitely becoming more of a trend, moving away, as you said, from large batch overnight interfaces, moving to a more rapid exchange of data between Infor and third-party systems. Of course, a web service node is great for data that's driven from the Infor side that we're pushing out to another system, or maybe we're using our web service node to pull back data, but the transaction is driven from the IPA side. If you have a third-party system that needs to send data in to Infor, and you need to be able to wait and respond for that, there is a HTTP trigger available in IPA. So your external system can be programmed to just make a web call into IPA to initiate the running of a flow. There's information on that in the IPA Administrator's Guide. Just check out the HTTP trigger. The CrossRef Tables is a little known, really valuable nugget here in IPA. Did you know that IPA contains an area for you to load up mapping data or translation data that can be used in interfaces? This feature was designed to power the GHR to S3 interface, mapping of position codes or what have you. But it's available for you to use for any kind of interface flow that you might need it for. Check out the XREF screen in Rich Client, and take a look at how you might make creative use of the screen to store any sort of mapping data that your interface flow would need. That'll help you get the mapping out of hard coding that's harder to maintain and into a place that's easy to change. Of course, the XREF tables live within a data area, so that also allows you to set up different values in a test environment for testing than you might have in a live environment. All right, so let's talk about a couple of cool things we can do with IPA that'll help out with system administration. One thing that we've been doing a lot, especially for our managed service customers, are to build out some loss and health checks or routine maintenance with IPA. You can do things like checking for jobs and recovery status and archiving log files and what have you. Anything that's a routine process that you need to remember to do manually from time to time. Think about potentially moving that into a flow so it runs on schedule. You don't forget to do it, and the system does it the same way every time and lets you know of any issues. Another thing we'll do with IPA is actually set up a flow that just runs through some basic functionality to prove that the system is working. We've created flows that will execute smoke tests and run through a series of system tests, and we'll schedule those to run periodically. So then they can send proactive alerts if we're not getting the right response back. So an administrator can come in and maybe take a look at a problem before our end users start to notice it as well. With such a flow running every day or multiple times a day, we can record timings of various things like how long does the same AGS call take, and analyze trends over time. So if we see things start to become sluggish, we know it's an area we might need to look into for some proactive performance management.
So one thing that was, I don't want to say heavily used, but somewhat used in process flow in version 9 was a concept called admin tasks. And so this is functionality where we can allow our end users, to kind of spread out the administration of work units.
So as an example, maybe rather than having IT centrally manage every work unit and every possible work unit exception in the system, you might ask a procurement analyst or a materials analyst to maintain requisition approvals, and you might ask some staff in your HR group to maintain personnel action approvals, right? But we don't want those two separate business areas walking on top of each other over the top of the same work units. So how do we help our business units focus on just the work units that are relevant to them?
Right, and this was functionality that existed in the process flow, previous version of process automation, but the process flow utility. Problem now in IPA is it doesn't exist anymore. But the good news is there is a solution, and that's Configuration Console. We can now tweak the system using Configuration Console to make it do that former admin task functionality. So first thing though, you have to actually go and enable Configuration Console if you were a standalone S3 IPA instance only. It's delivered and the security is given there for global HR and contract management, but if you're just using the IPA instance, you need to go in and add that security class to a role so that you can have access to the Configuration Console. Once you have that access, then what we're going to do is we're going to create a user field called admin task and define this with certain states. So in this example, I'm breaking out the administrative responsibilities to AP, HR, and materials management. So I'm creating that user field with those three states. Now I'm going to create this on the PFI work unit and the PFI flow definition business classes. And we'll step through as to where that then gets applied. So in the flow definition form now in your configuration setup data, you now want to modify this form and add this new field. You can see it here as a drop down that you can choose from those options that you selected. And then on the work unit screen itself, excuse me, you want to add that same field. Now you'll notice here that it's read only, and that's because when we add it to the business class, to the PFI work unit business class, we're going to set the default value. And because there's a relation defined between the work unit and the flow definition, we can pull that definition, that value from the flow definition for this particular work unit. So it's automatically populated as soon as that work unit is created. And again, that gets set as the default value for the PFI work unit business class. Once that's there and in place, The only other thing then is the security piece. So you have to go in and tweak security a little bit, and you're basically just looking for that value to make sure that, and then you're creating additional roles and security classes. You're going to need to create one per state that you have defined for that user field, but then you can assign those different roles to different functional users. So it might be your HRIS analyst, your MMIS analyst, those key analysts in those business areas, and now you're giving them functionality. In this particular example, I'm just giving them view-only access for all inquiries, but you can update that to give them full access to be able to cancel work units and really truly administer that.
Wow. That's a great way to use Configuration Console to augment and extend a Landmark application. You know, we're used to doing that type of work with global HR, with contract management, and it's really great that we can take some of those techniques and apply them here to Infor Process Automation. You know, adding a field and setting up the ability for that field to propagate to work units.
Yep. So now the moment you've all been waiting for. What's new in Process Automation version 11?
Yeah, and first things first, our customers out there running Lawson 10, can they take advantage of Infor Process Automation 11?
Yes, they can. And I believe we have a detail slide on that near the end.
Great.
But yes, it is just a simple CU. Essentially, it's like a CU upgrade to your Landmark technology layer. And there are certain version requirements that have to be met as well.
Cool. So everything we're going to show you here should be available to you in your Lawson 10 environment when you apply that update.
So just to highlight a couple of the new features here. First thing that you'll notice is that all the administration is now in HTML5. So the rich client still exists, but now you have an option to pull it all from the web. So all your configuration, your setup, administering work units and monitoring work units can all be done via the HTML5 interface.
IPA version 10 has a web administrative interface too, but this one is a lot easier to use.
Right. So looking at user-defined processes, something that's new here, so you now have a view option. When you're looking at the list of your processes, you can click on that view button and it will actually right up in the web page load up a view of that process. So you no longer have to have Designer on your machine if you simply just want to look at the flow and try to understand what's happening with it. So there's a new channel called the user channel that's available. So if you're familiar with channels in IPA today, there's things like the file channel, message queues where you can use those to trigger flows. So the user channel is basically like sending IPA an email. And based on the subject, there's different things that the system will respond with. The my request goes out and will look at the system and see, okay, what action requests do you personally have? And it will send you back a report and basically says, okay, here's all the work units that were triggered by you, and here's the current status of them. And this is for ones that are currently active. So ones that are completed wouldn't show up in that report. There's the service trigger, which of course, so that will actually trigger a process flow to run in the back end. And you would specify, again, this stuff in the subject of the email. System status, so if you want to just get a feel for how your system's performing, it'll send you some high-level statistics. And then if you're looking for a specific work unit, you can include that work unit number in the email subject, and the system will send back an email to say, here's where your work unit is, it's waiting for so-and-so for approval. As we look at the designer itself, it's mostly the same. There's a few extra nodes, and I'll kind of go over with them now. The biggest difference with the designer is that IPD.jar file that you need to install the designer on your machine, you no longer have to go out to Infor's website to download that for each CU. It's delivered via URL directly from your Landmark system. So as you get upgraded, as your Landmark system is patched, you just go to this URL and it will give you the IPD jar file directly.
Oh, that's super convenient when you're applying Landmark updates that you don't always have to remember to go and download the new version of the designer. You always have the latest version, just as you always have the appropriate rich client version.
Right. So for cloud customers, there's now file access capability to the Amazon S3 cloud, and that's built in as one of your options in your file activity connection configuration. So when you're setting that up, you can now connect to the cloud on a limited basis. So there's restrictions around where you can put and place files and read from, but it is now accessible to you. So I gave you a little teaser earlier about something that would be easier with version 11, and that was the account provisioning, checking the security, checking to make sure those profiles, the PFI user profiles, are created. So if you build all that in a process, and what version 11 has is what they call a subprocess. So you can build that functionality out in a flow by itself and call it a subprocess. So when you're saving it, there's this flag here that indicates that it's a subprocess. Now with the subprocess node in your flow, you can pick that subprocess, and then we'll actually call that subprocess as a subroutine. So you're building a function that's commonly used. So I mentioned about that. So all of your process flows, as you start to build them out, and you say, hey, I want to automatically create the PFI user profile, or I want to automatically do this each time. Rather than embedding that logic in all of your process flows, just build it once in a subprocess and then call that single subprocess from all your other flows. The nice thing is, because it's all processed real time in memory, the variables that exist in the parent are available to you in the subprocess and vice versa. So another new feature is the SMS notification. This does require a third-party setup with Twilio, so that is a paid service that you have to provide. But once you have that account, you can set that up, and there's a SMS connection in the configuration screens where you just have to define that key that you get once you set up that account. And then it's as simple as basically dragging that SMS node and selecting users. So this does rely on the phone number, the cell phone number, being associated with their landmark actor record to be tied there, or you can specifically hard code numbers in here as well. Another new node for notifications is the social feed, and so if you're using the Mingle Enterprise where you have the feed, the news feed item in your Mingle, you can send messages directly to that, and you can define, if they go to a specific user or any users that are connected, or to a group, and it could be based on things that people are following.
Mm-hmm. That'll be really valuable as our customers transition to Mingle version 12, which I think really brings all of the value of notification and collaboration to a point where it's ready to be adopted, and there's not quite that barrier to entry that we had with earlier versions of Mingle, where you needed to specifically have an enterprise version.
Right. So you've always been able to query the loss in LDAP through the RM nodes. Well, now there is an LDAP Query node that allows you to connect to any LDAP. So you could be connecting to your corporate LDAP for Active Directory information. So you could be pulling information. So whatever you can do in a search, you can build that search string out here and query that LDAP. And then there is also a landmark admin node, which basically allows you to do DB imports and DB exports. This is very useful for interfacing. So, as you look at an interface, you're getting a file in, and it's a batch file coming in with a lot of transactions, a lot of records in it. In process automation, if you were processing that, you used to have to just basically loop through that line by line, or use some system command nodes to push that out. Well, now there's the DB import and DB export commands that are built in directly, so you can process that file and allow those command line utilities just easier access to those command line utilities. And as we mentioned, upgrading to IP11, it is an in-place upgrade from your current landmark 10.1.1 environment. It does require LSF, Loss and System Update Foundation version 10.09, and now Java 8 is supported and actually recommended as we look at that.
Yeah, if you're thinking about upgrading to Landmark, that's a great time to look at bringing the Java version up, maybe across your Infor solution. This is great news for our customers, that this is a fairly straightforward update from Landmark 10.1.1. Just need to update grid, update Landmark runtime. Maybe that's a great time to put in the latest WAS service pack as well. But it's not a major overhaul like it was getting the Landmark in the first place, or moving, say, from an earlier Windows version. All this can be done with a pretty minimal downtime. All right, and with that, we'll take any questions.
I do have one. Okay, this is earlier in the presentation, do the users have to be in the loss and security to be able to view these messages? I'm not 100% sure which messages.
I think the answer is going to be yes. So all approvers need to have user accounts in the system. In the back end, it's essentially the same as a core user. The only difference is what roles are assigned. But all of the account setup has to be done for anyone who's going to potentially approve something from IPA.
Okay, another question is, does IPA 11 support REST?
Oh, yes. IPA 11 does support the REST API. So all of the Landmark 11 introduces REST API across the whole platform. So every business class becomes enabled with REST functionality. So you can use an external system to bring data in to the IPA data area, or query data out using that REST web API.
Do we have another one? Okay. And SOAP still?
SOAP still too, yeah. So SOAP web services are just a little different, because while the REST API is sort of built into the platform, the SOAP web services need to be specifically created through Configuration Console.